Hello everyone, I'm Sukriti Rastogi, a development professional of 6 years, working for the basic rights of women and children. Welcome to the first episode of the dialogue series. Our topic for today is a hard reality for many married women in India and across the world, that is marital rape. To understand it from the legal and social lens, we have with us Ms. Sneha Mukherjee. Sneha is a human rights advocate and activist practicing in the Supreme Court of India. She is also the director of Women Justice Initiative, Human Rights Law Network. Over the last 8 years, she has represented women in cases relating to gender based violence, sexual and reproductive health rights. Sneha was one of the advocates representing a survival of marital rape seeking its criminalization in the much talked about litigation before the High Court. Welcome, Sneha, to the dialogue series.
Thank you so much.
To start this dialogue on the marital rape, I'll be asking you some questions. So, firstly, what is marital rape and how do you look at it within the Indian society?
I think, simply put, marital rape is any form of sexual violence, sexual assault, rape by the husband on his wife. So this is the simplest definition on understanding of marital rape. Now, how you look at it from the Indian perspective, or from where the Indian society looks at it, is a very, very complex question, because there are really two views to it. One which says that marital rape does not exist, it's not a thing, because how could a husband rape his wife? Like, there cannot be a concept of consent and rape within a marriage, because it goes against the basic fundamental sanctity of the institution. And then there is the alternate view that we perhaps will explore more today, is that rape is rape, and the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim has absolutely nothing to do with the act itself. So irrespective of whether it is a stranger or whether it is the husband or somebody related, rape is still rape. Lack of consent is rape. So these are the two perspectives that really, sort of take a play when we talk about how the society in India looks at marital rape as an issue. And that whole discussion around whether it should be criminalized or it should not be criminalized is basically, I think, a dialogue and an argument between these two sort of set of groups and these two set of principles.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. Actually, the next question is also focusing on the same thing, which says that there's a lot of discussion that marital rape isn't a thing. So, and we wanted to know your views on that, but you've already said about that. But what do you think about this angle of looking at marital rape?
See, I'll tell you how I look at marital rape. I am of the view that the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim has absolutely no, I think, connection to the crime or the act. And therefore, to me, marital rape is just rape. It is rape perpetrated by the husband on their wife. But it is very, very important to understand what the perspectives are, which is why I'll probably discuss a little why this whole conversation around marital rape not being rape, or it should not, the whole conversation and discussion around why it should not be criminalized, and what really are the layers and conversations around it, because there are multiple. It is not just whether it should be criminalized or it should not be, but it is also that if it were to be criminalized, would it be an offense of the same gravity as rape, or would it be a lesser offense, I think. And then, would the punishment for marital rape be just as much as rape, or should it be less? So these are the conversations that are very important, and these are the conversations that we have been happening in the courts, outside the courts, within the legal and social fraternity, I think. So I think the history of this whole conversation around why marital rape is not rape, as in why it is that a husband cannot rape his wife, this concept does not exist, is because in the 1800s, there was some Matthew Hale who said, the whole principle, I think, comes down from there, and there have been a lot of disagreements. But he was the first one who said that the principle basically is this, that, once a woman is married to a man, she becomes his property. So, which means that there is perpetual consent. Once you have consented to marriage, there is perpetual consent, and the consent of the woman does not matter anymore, because the moment she's consented to marriage and she has married the man, he does not require her consent. So she becomes a chattel. She's not a person with equal rights. She's a chattel. So that is the term that is used in the principle, that she's a chattel. But and somehow this principle has found variations, developments, but the core idea has remained. And that is what is still argued, that in a marital relationship, in, you know, within the institution of marriage and the sanctity of this relationship and how the community and the society looks at marriage, there is very little scope and understanding for consent within sexual relationships between the husband and wife, because it is understood that there is consent. It's presumed, the consent is presumed in a marriage. Now that is I think a notion that we constantly try to rebut, because irrespective of whether you are married or not married, or you are in a live-in relationship, or any form, I think consent becomes the basis for sex, right? So it cannot be because it's a marriage. I mean, you don't need consent because it is a marriage. No, it is not that. And there has been a lot of discussion around how consent is very, very, it's a very complicated issue when it comes to marriage. How we look at it is, it's not. Consent is still consent. Why it is complicated is because in a marriage, it is very easy to coerce consent. And we have seen and we have discussed these scenarios, that what are the zillion scenarios in which consent can be coerced in a marriage, and it could still look like consent, right? For example, I'll give you a simple example. If the husband today says that if you don't have sex with me, I will walk out of this marriage. There are so many situations. This is just one example. And you would find a lot of women feeling compelled to give in, because if the husband walks out, she will lose a home. She might not find support from her family. She will also lose economic security that the marriage provides. And also, I think a lot of social security is attached to the institution of marriage. And a lot of women find themselves compelled to consent. Now, how we see it is that this is coerced consent. This is not freely given consent. And if consent is conditional, it is not consent at all. But within a marriage, there is a lot of debate around the fact that even in conditions like this, if the woman has actually consented, you will look at it as consent. This is still consent, and it is not, there is no, I think, understanding of coercion. But it is very, very important to understand that any relationship has its own power structure. Any relationship has its own, I think, hierarchy. And not criminalizing marital rape actually enforces the fact that there needs to be a power structure within the marriage and the institution of marriage, isn't it? And that is something that we constantly try to argue against, that in today's day and age where we are constantly talking about gender equality, how is it that we as a constitution and we as a democracy fail to provide that safety and that equality to women within marriages? Because somehow we have these big old debates about how there has to be gender equality and how we are talking about everything else. But the moment we talk about marriages and we talk about this institution and the sanctity and the morality, this high moral place, I think the institution holds, suddenly all of the conversation around equality goes down the drain. All of this conversation around consent goes down the drain. And that is something that happened in courts also. You will see courts that say that, you know, marital rape is not a thing. We have seen in the last 2 years, various district and high courts passing orders wherein they have actually identified, recognized marital rape as rape and punished the husband. And we have seen courts not saying that marital rape is not a thing and have dismissed complaints. So, you know, everything, I think, because of this one exception that the law has, I think it has affected a woman's power to actually go and proceed against their husband. And that is something that is held against women because they are not being able to do it. So I think.
Thanks. I think two things that you pointed here. First, when you talked about 1700, where going back to 1700, so we are linking it to our colonial past as well, and where this patriarchal exception in our law is still relevant. And the other thing that you've talked about is the coerced consent and the lack of social and financial support, which directly and indirectly both are, not helping women in situations like marital rape. So yeah, it's very important to look at these aspects while talking about marital rape. Thanks, Sneha. I'll move on to the other question. So, when rape outrages emotions of people, then what hinders to even recognize marital rape? And you have already talked about it. And you have also talked about that how the characters, though, are similar, but still there is a difference because of the patriarchy which seeps in our society. So, do you think that it is justified? What are your views regarding that?
I'll tell you something that happened in the court, because I think a lot of you who are attending today probably have heard about the litigation that went on in Delhi High Court recently, earlier this year. It was like a 3-month long proceeding where the courts heard, a division bench of the court heard whether this exception needs to be read down or not. So one of the judges, I think this is something that he has pointed out in his judgment. So it's a split judgment. So there was one judge who strongly believed that the exception should go, and there was another judge who believed that the exception should stay. So the judge who believed that the exception should stay, so he, during the arguments, when the arguments were further, and even I think this is something that he writes in his judgment also, he does actually, he says that, and this is something that I feel is fundamentally flawed, and I don't think there is any logic to this. He says that there is a lot of difference between a woman being raped by a stranger and the agony a woman feels when raped by a stranger, and the agony that a woman feels when any sexual abuse is perpetrated by the husband. Now, I believe that as long as we believe that in India, first of all, I think factually in India, 70% or 80% rapes are not committed by strangers. If you look at the statistics, they are not committed by strangers. They are committed by people the victim is known to, people with whom she has a fiduciary relationship. It can be a family member, a friend, a neighbor, a person who she knows. So this whole concept about stranger rape and marital rape, I think that is flawed. Secondly, to believe that somehow the degree of violence a woman faces when rape is perpetrated by the husband is somehow much lower, because that is the thing that was argued, that a woman cannot at all feel that way, feel that level of agony if she's raped by a husband, because she's had sex with her husband before and they live in an intimate familial setup. So how can she possibly feel violated to that extent as it would be in the case where the rape is perpetrated by a stranger, even if I had to argue a stranger or somebody with whom she does not share an intimate relationship? I think this is something very fundamental that goes to the argument of why, women, why is it so difficult to actually go ahead and file the complaints? Because as long as we as a society believe that a woman cannot possibly feel the violence when it comes from the husband, we will keep denying her access to justice, isn't it? She goes and talks. She's, in most cases, because I have represented more than one victims of marital rape, I have seen women who have come right out within a week, within 10 days, within a month, and gone to the police. And I have seen women who have stayed in those marriages for years and then come out and sought help. So there are several reasons for it. And one of the most important reasons is that when a woman tries to reach out to somebody she trusts with this information that she's facing violence, more often than not, she's either disbelieved or she's discouraged from going to the police and filing a complaint. Because somehow the onus always boils down to the woman to prove that it was in fact violence. Because our society believes that within a marital setup, there can be no violence, in the sense that a lot of things are actually okayed within.
Yeah.
Right. Physical abuse is okay, verbal abuse is okay. Sexual abuse does not really exist, because how can it? So as long as we as a society believe that, we cannot possibly allow women the space to actually go ahead, because it does in fact take a lot of courage and strength to stand up against your own family, and within a marital status set up to go and complain. Because in, I think, 9 out of 10 cases, that you would be alone, and it'll be a very, very long struggle. So we understand why it is very, very difficult for women to actually go ahead and make those complaints. And it is also reflected in the legislation. Even today, after all of these debates, litigation, this specific set of litigation in Delhi High Court went on for 6-7 years. The government had the stand that they are considering criminalization 7 years back. They had the same position 7 years later when the final arguments were heard. They refused to argue on what their position was on this issue during the arguments. They said, we are considering, and they're still considering. So as long as the legislature, keeps something so urgent at abeyance, how are we to have faith that there will be a system created to safeguard and to allow women, not to safeguard, just to allow women the avenue to actually go and proceed and file complaints and take this situation in their hand?
Yeah. You also said about power position, and I would like to add that there the power of males or the husbands is seen as a right. Maybe it's verbal violence or physical, emotional violence, as well as sexual violence. And the duty of the wife or females in a marital setup to, obey to those demands or to those commands as well. So that's why, and believing in that whole setup, we are looking at our society as well as our legal legislature and judiciary as well.
I absolutely agree with you, because especially within this is something that we discuss amongst ourselves also when we have these cases, that when we talk about violence within a marital setup, most often I think sexual violence, all forms of violence are actually accepted, honestly. But even within the forms of I think the recognized forms of violence is sexual and economic violence is something that has absolutely no recognition in the society at all. Because consent and money are two things that women have no power over anyways, in any setup. Within I think, within any household, I think it's very little that women have the power of consent or power to decide monetary matters. So that plays a role. And of course, what you said, I completely agree with, that it is the power always stays in the hand of the man. In a marriage, in a family setup, it is always that, which is why it is always that any form of violence is seen as something that is absolutely acceptable and okay.
Okay, so we also talk about the Domestic Violence Act here, and how does the protection of women from the Domestic Violence Act provide civil remedies to the victims of marital rape? And do you think that any amendments in this act can be helpful to the victims?
See, it is true that the Domestic Violence Act recognizes sexual abuse, but it only has civil remedies. It will provide you compensation, it will provide you residence, it will provide you maintenance. But I believe that if a woman wants to seek civil remedy, completely fine. But I think in cases of physical and sexual violence, I think women should have the right to also proceed criminally. And that is an avenue that we are denying them by by specifically keeping an exception that does not allow women to proceed criminally. Because it is a very, very serious offense. And the nature of violence is very severe. And there, the woman should have the right to proceed criminally if she wishes to. So I think that is an avenue, because within the DV Act, the scope is very, very limited in terms of remedy. So if a victim wishes to proceed only within the civil law remedies available, she always has the DV Act. But trust me when I say this, a lot of women would proceed criminally if they had the power to. A lot of women try to, and they fail because there is no law, firstly. And we have a system that I think strategically demoralizes women from actually proceeding and going ahead. It's not simple. Our system is not simple. Filing the complaint, getting the MLC done, the registration of FIR, the entire medical procedure, and then the entire litigation. It's a very, very long and tedious journey. And it's also a very lonely one for women because they don't find the kind of support that they should, not just from within their families, but also from the stakeholders, the government stakeholders, the law enforcement. So I think that plays a very important role. So I think there should be systems in place, and there should be the possibility for women to proceed criminally in these cases, given the nature of offense.
Yes, thanks, Sneha. Um, Coming to the last question, that those who have faced marital rape, and what can be done to overcome those challenges? What are the steps that can be taken, both in terms of legal avenues as well as any other helplines or mental health, maybe looking at the mental health. So what can be done in those situations?
I think as far as legal, I think remedy is concerned, there's very little one can do right now, honestly. Very little that can effectively work. That does effectively work because there's a lot of to and fro. While there is no law, while there is a law that specifically decriminalizes marital rape, it is very difficult, almost impossible for women to actually navigate the system and get a complaint registered where they can be heard. It is very time consuming and tedious because you go to the police station, the police will say, madam, this is not, this is something this is not an offense. Or we would not file a complaint. Even if they did, their investigation will not be done properly. So I think the first step is to really advocate for a law that provides women the support that she requires legally to proceed. There are several helplines. So I work out of Delhi, and Delhi has 3-4 helplines which allow women to complain, to seek shelter. And I think most states have some helpline run by the Women's Commission or the local police force, wherein they can reach out in case of an SOS situation. We are still sort of navigating the rehabilitation part because as a country, we do not have a very strong rehabilitation infrastructure. We don't. That is also something that I think is parallelly being argued in different courts across the country, that the country requires a very, very strong infrastructure to support rehabilitation for women who have suffered violence in different forms. The number of shelter homes are very limited. I think the given budget for those shelter homes are so limited that they are in a very, very bad state. There are no services, and the instances of abuse from within these homes are very, very rampant. And there are so many cases that we're dealing with where women are scared to go and live in the shelter homes because of the abuse and management issues and administrative issues, because really, like, human resource, finance, infrastructure, everything is lacking. So that is I think a whole new conversation on its own, honestly. But at this point, I think what I as a lawyer tell all other lawyers, that every time somebody reaches out to you, you do what they need to get that FIR registered, and you get the procedure done immediately and rightly. Because as long as we as lawyers push for these cases and we provide the support to these women, I think we can reach somewhere. Because very often we fail to provide, I think, the legal support that they require. Either it is because we look at the law in a very, very strict way, that, there is a provision that says that it cannot be a criminal offense, so then there is no way. But no, there are different ways of looking at the law. And just because it is still an offense, right? We still look at marital rape as an offense. We are constantly struggling with the fact that it has been decriminalized with that exception. But that should not stop us from going to the police, from going to the court if the police is not registering an FIR. There are avenues, there are procedures built in the law. We just have to find it in ourselves to go and actually pursue those avenues and those, the powers under the law. So that is something that I always ask I do a lot of pro bono work, and I ask all of my colleagues and friends that as long as we have those alternate remedies under the law, we need to do something and use those to go as far as we can, because I know that in most cases, these cases end up going to the high courts. Some have even gone to the Supreme Court, and that is how we have seen progressive judgments come from the high courts and Supreme Courts. So we can't really give up now.
Thank you, Sneha. Thank you so much for your insights today. This has been a crucial session in generating awareness on marital rapes in India. And I would like to hand over to Ritu Pratu now so that he can ask our viewers if they have any questions.
Right. So if you guys have any questions, you can ask, you can unmute yourself and ask her directly, or you can use the chat box. To start off, I have a question which I want to ask you. So Sneha, do you believe that the whole idea of sanctity of marriage actually has an adverse effect on the fact that these kind of domestic violences, because this is one of the gruesome kinds of domestic violence, as you have already mentioned. So does the whole concept of sanctity of marriage and the whole idea of marriage cannot be broken at any cost, or that actually sits into the judiciary as well?
Yes, absolutely, I have. But I mean, see, first of all, people who are in the judiciary and people who are in the legislature are people from the same society you and I belong to, right? So they are subject to the same biases. They are people who are looking at marriage and marriage from the same societal lens as you and I are. So I think that plays a very important role. And of course, as long as you believe that marriage is somehow an institution that is beyond the law, and somehow the laws and the rules that apply to everything else do not have to apply to marriage, because it's a marriage, so it has, and marriage forms the basis of society, civilized society, that is the argument. So as long as we are protecting the civilized society, women can continue to become collateral damage. Yes, of course, this whole idea that marriage, the institution of marriage, has to be safeguarded at any cost, even if it means that the rights of women have to be chopped off, and they can continue to be collateral damage. The power it's okay if the power is taken away from them, because then it is for the greater purpose of safeguarding the society. I think, yes, of course, that affects everything, not just marital rape. Marital rape is a very, very big issue within it, but also absolutely any form of domestic violence and anything, because of this one notion.
Right. And a follow-up question. We have, of course, like we know that the balance of power is tilted heavily towards the man. But as you know, as you know about my research is mainly on the male victims of honor crimes. So in that context, since the definition of rape now has evolved from just being binary, gender binaries, so do you believe that like men can also, of course, men can also be raped, but then marital rape can also happen to men? It does. And then how difficult or how different is the experience of coming out and telling it to somebody? And also, how is the experience different, like internally as well?
See, I'll tell you this is something that we have actually discussed while we were arguing the case in High Court. And we talked about how we need to really look at marital rape also from a more gender inclusive lens. And that is when we realized that if you really look at our law, especially the criminal law in our country, it's gender binary. It does not, it's everything is man and woman, man and woman, man and woman, right? So which is, and if you have been, I think, following the litigation that is going on in Delhi High Court regarding, regarding, I think there is a case which is basically arguing about acceptance of gay marriages within the Hindu law. And the government's position on that, even today, I believe, is that we cannot allow it. Hindu marriage, Hindu laws talk about man and woman. It's right. and we cannot allow it. So that is what I think becomes very, very problematic, because in any case, although now 377 has been decriminalized and there is a lot of movement around the rights of the poor community, I think even then it is very, very difficult to find a very supportive system where people can actually come out and file complaints. I have actually represented individuals from same-sex relationships where they wanted to pursue complaints of physical and sexual abuse within live-in situations. And I know the kind of struggle they've had to go through and we have had to go through to sort of navigate the system. I was physically manhandled in police station for representing an individual. They were constantly threatened. And that is just one example. So to be able to find, I think, any kind of recourse in the law for something as severe as marital rape in, marriages and relationships that our community and the law is still not ready to accept, I think it is a whole new level of challenge, really. And to be very honest, we are also at a stage where we are going one case at a time. I don't believe that most of us have a foolproof formula of how to really go about these cases. It's very factual and we are trying to really take it one day at a time sort of situation.
All right. Thank you, Sneha. The others, if you are ready with your questions.
Yeah. Hi, Sneha.
Hi.
Yeah.
That there. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. I hope I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So it was really informative. It's really nice to hear from you after such a long period of time as well. So I just wanted to ask, like, since the matter is before the Supreme Court now, and we hope that it finally goes in our favor, one of the arguments that I firmly believe will be put forth by the other party is regarding its misuse. I think it will be because we know Section 498A has been.
It has been
498A has been misused. So what will be our answer if something like that comes up to prevent like 498A situation doesn't happen?
See, I'll tell you one thing. The court today needs to decide whether this law needs to go or this law needs to stay.
Okay.
Tell me one law that can or cannot be misused. Is there any provision in the law that you are 100% certain कि इसका misuse नहीं हो सकता? Even the existing rape laws, 375, 376.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you certain that it will not be misused? They are misused. There will always be a possibility. But does that mean that the law should go? If we today stick by the logic that, there is a possibility that this might be misused, so there should not be a law at all. By that argument, the whole IPC will go. Because every other provision of law can always be misused. What needs to be decided today is whether this specific exception is good in law or not. Whether it stands the argument of under Constitution, whether it can survive that test, or whether it does not. And I think to our minds, it cannot survive. There is no intelligible differentia, because that has been argued, right? There is an intelligible differentia between married and unmarried people. What is the intelligible differentia? How does it matter at all? Isn't it? Right. How does the relationship matter at all? So we cannot go into the argument that every law can be misused. And that cannot be an excuse to not strike down or read down a law that itself, not having that law is actually violating women's rights to a very, very large extent. Imagine the number of women who would find recourse if there was a law, who would find the strength to actually stand up and go. Isn't it? But if we keep on holding to the logic that it can be misused, then by that standard, women, not just married women, anybody would not have recourse. Because, of course, you would never find recourse for any kind of violation because everything can be misused. So it's to our understanding, and this is what we also argue, that this cannot be an excuse at all. You are the court, the judiciary needs to decide whether this law is good, it is constitutionally valid, or it needs to go. Right. And see, in any criminal litigation, every case depends on their own set of facts, the evidence, the cross, all of that will happen anyways. If we start scrutinizing every possible situation that can occur, we will never get out of this. It's a ship, it's a sinking ship there. And that is not how you legislate law, do you? Think about every possible scenario. You don't. You look at a law, you look at a situation, and you say that this is a reality. This is happening. And either this law stays or this goes. If it stays, what are the repercussions? If it goes, what are the repercussions? And then you look at the constitution and you see if it survives the test. If it does, fine. If it doesn't, it needs to go because it's a bad law. And that's about it. That's about it, nothing else.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sneha. Rashika, I think you have a question.
Yeah, hi. You spoke really well. I love the way you talk and explained. I'm not from law background, but I'm just really passionate about this, about women's issues. And so I wanted to ask that, do you think, in my opinion, I think that sex education would be one way to solve this problem from the root. Like, the concept of consent has to be taught. So that's very important. I like to try and talk about it a lot and spread awareness about it. So how do you think that could help? How do you think the law sees sex education? Because many people, many Indian parents are not happy with it, right? They don't want to give it. And yeah,
I think I'll tell you something that I believe in. I don't think our country is ready for sex education in schools. It has been advocated for very, very long. Everybody is constantly saying that there needs to be some form of sex education in schools because it's important. As far as consent is concerned, it's not just sex.
Yeah.
Right. What is extremely flawed, according to me, in our society is how we bring up our kids. Right. If any of you have had seen brothers and sisters growing up, men are taught to hold on to power from the very, very young age.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think is problematic. Because
Ghar ki izzat. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah, exactly.
That whole thing.
Yes. So if you teach them from a very young age that you have a certain power and you will always have that power. And if you don't have it, you can take it. You are in a manner teaching them that consent is yours to take. It is not the other person's to give. Consent, not just in an intimate relationship, consent in anything. And then that eventually, I think, perpetrates into relationships in different way. So I think you gotta teach consent. And when you're teaching consent, you're not just talking about intimate relationships. You're talking about general behavior. Right?
Yeah.
Because consent is a part of your everyday behavior. It is not just what is limited inside your bedroom. It's your everyday behavior. What you allow yourself to do, how you see the world, what you think is acceptable of you to do and not, everything is about consent. So that needs to be taught. If you teach that right, they will know consent. And there are people who understand consent.
Yeah.
Very, very few, I must add, but right, yes. So when you teach consent, you have to teach behavior and how the world should ideally behave, men and women, like all genders alike. So that is how you teach consent, I think. And if that happens, then probably, and that teaching consent and behavior in that manner can happen today also, because that does not require explicit sex education. That requires sensitizing the professionals who are teaching the kids, who are around them, that you cannot really treat people of different genders differently. You cannot tell one person that, you need to talk a certain way, smile and sit a certain way, be a certain way, and tell the other person, you will always, it's okay to do certain things.
Yeah.
Because you are allowed to act a certain way. Right. So that is how we are teaching them that it is okay to do things. That is how we are teaching them that you don't really need consent. You don't really need to care how your actions affect another person, because it's okay to do it. So we can start there, and that is something that's doable today, and it should be done, I think.
So you think the onus is on, basically, there can't be a law. Schools are not going to do it. I know, yeah.
Schools not. I think the government will also not want the schools to do it.
Yeah.
But parents
The-
can, individuals can.
Yeah, I've seen that whenever I have tried to talk about this, millennial parents, the new generation now that are becoming parents, they have been more open to this.
Yes.
And so
Because
that's
see,
hope.
yeah, I think yes, because there are more people in this generation who are willing to take the crooked road. Because I always say that for generations we have been taught to walk in a straight line. This is how you eat, this is how you sleep, this is how you behave, this is how you act. And it's very easy to follow that straight line because nobody questions you. But the moment you start questioning them and say that no, but there's a better way of doing it, so I'm going to take that, everybody's going to turn around and say, but why? And a lot of people find it very tedious to respond to that why, so they might just as well walk straight. So there are more people willing to take the other road now and question I think the same principles that have been followed for generations than there were, I think, than there were in our parents' generations and generations previous to that. So maybe there's still hope.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneha. The next question, I think, is from Sukriti. You had a
Yes.
hand raised, I guess.
Actually, then I was clapping for what Sneha had said.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah,
So-
but adding to what Rakshita and Sneha have rightly said, and about the sex education, I would also say that teaching about gender education, the difference between sex and gender.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and that can be done at the schools or in general, to teach people around us about to go ahead with equality, respect, dignity that we're talking, which has to do a lot when it comes to power in marriages, and which, about that we had talked earlier about duty and commands. So to start at homes, to start at school, about saying that the equality is right within there is a certain biological difference, nothing beyond that. So, talking about it in a more social way, to understand that everyone deserves dignity and has to give their consent, his or her. So even, yeah, as said, marital rape cannot be about only women or only men. It has to be more inclusive.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think it needs to start with also sensitizing teachers. Because I think that is something that has been advocated for very long, that we need to have sensitization programs for teachers who can then, I think, teach kids in schools about gender equality and about gender education, because that is also very important. Because there are different forms of violence and violence perpetrated on kids also in school that they are not comfortable talking about. And I think what you said is very, very accurate, because if that happens, that will give way to, I think, a lot of change.
Absolutely. Yeah, the next question, I think, was from Tanishka. Tanishka, if you can hear me. We saw a hand raised over there. Yes, Rashika, you can go ahead. And Bilal, I'll take your question after that. So yeah, and keep it short because we are about to end. So we can have two more questions.
Can
so
I-
one from Rashika and the other one from Bilal.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yes.
go ahead.
Yeah, hi Sneha. It was a very good seminar by you. Very informative. I just want to appreciate. I just want to expand Siddharth's question. I have a feeling, or even state governments have given a view, and I have considered it a little. Don't you feel this martial rape crime will become a crime without witnesses? Because there are very late witnesses, or there are one or two witnesses in this case.
Can I ask you a question? How many cases of sexual abuse actually happen in the public?
Yep.
Pardon?
How many cases of sexual abuse happen in public? Do you know?
I don't know. As you, I am working according to your data. You are saying 80% are from the person who are in a fiduciary.
You did not get my question. I'm asking you, what do you
Yeah.
think? How many cases of sexual abuse or rape happen in public spaces, in the open, in front of public eye? It does not.
No, it does not. But no,
Exactly.
it does not. That I agree.
Exactly, it
But
does not.
the relationship is different. In that case, the relationship is different. If you are talking about public place, we are talking about some sort of sacred relationship, which
What is
so-called
tell me
sacred, I
what
would
is
say.
tell me what is sacred in a marital relationship?
I am just
What is the
that's why I'm
sacred
using the adjective so-called.
Oh,
I just
that
want.
is so. This I'll ask
Pardon.
you a question. So, what you are saying, when you take the sacred argument, you're essentially talking about the sanctity of marriage. That there is something very sacred about this relationship, and therefore it cannot be perpetrated. This is the argument that was taken by the state. That you have to safeguard. And what you are saying are two things. One is about the sacred nature of a marital relationship, and the other thing is about lack of witnesses. Lack of witnesses is a very different argument.
Yeah, basically the lack of witnesses. Exactly.
Lack of witness is something which I also said when I was answering Siddharth's question. Most cases of violences of sexual nature do not actually happen in a space where there are actual witnesses.
Right.
It can't.
Yeah.
They happen in closed spaces. Most people are not raped where there are witnesses. Nobody would be that stupid. If they are to perpetrate a crime like that, they will not do it in public eye.
Right.
It happens in closed spaces where there are no witnesses. And in so many cases, trust me when I say this, I have represented, I don't know how many women. Women struggle to provide evidence. And which is why I say that in every criminal case, facts will lie, as is may in each case. And each case will have to be adjudicated on its own facts and evidences. You cannot decide whether there can be or cannot be a law based on a scenario that may or may not happen. It is for the judge before whom it goes to decide whether there is credible evidence, whether there can be witnesses, whether those statements can be verified. And when you look at the rape law, the one that is there, we are not talking about marriage or no marriage. It says that when a woman files a complaint of rape, the accused person is arrested on the statement of the victim. So if you can do that for a woman, why does that change because she's now married and her husband is raping her? Because is it because you believe that just because she's married to this man, any form of violence perpetrated on her somehow becomes lesser or inconsequential as compared to everything else? As long as we believe that, we will continue to believe that marriage is so important an institution that it is above the law, that a married man can act above the law and will get, that is what has happened, isn't it? They have gotten away with it. How many men there are men who have gotten away with it because there is no law to support this. So you cannot, if you start legislating law ye soch ke ki witness nahi hoga, there are cases of abuse. There are also, not all murders also happen. No, this is an analogy that was given by Justice Hari Shankar, but not all murders also happen in the open.
Intelligible difference, yeah, like you had put, yeah,
Exactly.
that he had, yeah.
Exactly. This is not a reasoning at all. This cannot be a reasoning at all.
Right.
Every case fulfills the law. Yes, please. No. Go ahead. I was just repeating what I said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bilal, you had a hand raised. I'll come to you, Rashika. You had a question, so let's, Bilal.
Am I audible?
Yes, you
Yeah.
are.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This was an amazing seminar. I would also like to appreciate that. So, in the starting, you mentioned something. I kind of forgot about it, like a colonial evidence of women being property. So, are we drawing a line, or was that just an example, or are we drawing a colonial trajectory of women being property, or was that also there inherently in Indian culture as well? And when I say Indian culture, it is a little shabby idea, but as in the northern parts of India right now, like I'm referring to that, like in the northern parts of India, like was that culture already there before the British arrived with the colonial presence, or is it a colonial hangover that we are still following with a lot of laws that are already there in Constitution?
I'll tell you this. I am not the best person to answer this question, but what I have read and what I know is this: I think the original concept of marriage was not marriage. It was transfer of property. It was a way of transferring property. And I think that is something that holds right even for India. That women were married off to, I mean, look at even before, I think, the Britishers came in, and this whole, since we're talking about the colonial hangover, if you look at the history of the princely states also, and if you look at the history of the different, I think, kings, they would marry off their daughters to the bigger kingdoms so that the properties could be transferred. So that has not just held good, I think, in elite situations or in marriages that happened within, I think, kings and kingdoms, but also in within like people like us, in communities like us, where marriage was seen as transfer of property. It was a way of transfer of property. And that somehow perpetrates into this understanding that women are also part of that transfer of property. So it's not just land and chattels and movable properties being transferred from one family to the other, but also the woman. And unfortunately, that mindset still exists in our community. It's sad that even today we believe that women are essentially somehow lesser, and they still continue to be objects, if I may say so, with who do not have any power. In most I think family situations, you'll realize that women do not actually have real power, right? And we don't realize that. A simple example of it is even in the most progressive families, I might say, women do not have power over financial decisions. I mean, how many women do we know who have absolute power over their financial decisions? Even women who are working, who are very progressive, who come from progressive families. They are constantly told that they don't know better, that they might not know the right financial investments to make. They might know, but it is an assumption that they don't. So this is just an example of how it is today. And this is a very simple example, but I think that idea that women don't know better and the society and the husband should hold on to the power to make those decisions is something that has perpetrated from that idea that women are objects, women are chattels, especially within a marriage setup.
Right. Okay. Moving on, just the last question, Rashika, you wanted to ask the final one.
Yeah. So interesting thing I just said that, because I know many examples of what you just said. I am an example of that. Anyway,
all of us are examples of that.
So I wanted to ask, so what about the juvenile laws? Because boys under 18 also cause a lot of harm. And like, can there be any improvement? Because I know, again, boys also get away with many things, that the abuse that they can cause in schools. Yes. So what's I'd just like to know more about that. Yeah.
I think it's a very when it comes to the juvenile law, and when we talk about child rights, I think there are systems in place that do not work very effectively. And also then, like within schools also, I think somehow if it is this whole, I think I won't say power structure, but I will say the gender disparity of what is allowed and what is not allowed allows people to get away with it. Because if a child is acting a certain way in school also, I think a lot of people believe they punish them. Don't tell them why it was wrong, punish them. Kaan pakad ke khada kar do. Don't teach them why it was wrong. I say teach them, tell them why it was wrong. Because you punish them, they are going to do it again. Because when has ever deterrent measures helped anybody? Right? There's a reason we believe in the reformative system. Right? One of the very important reasons why we have JJBs, juvenile justice boards and homes, because when there is a child, there is somebody under the age of 18 who has perpetrated violence, right? They are kept in homes, right? They're not put behind bars, because they need to be taught why something is correct and why something is not, and they are very young. although I don't think these homes work very effectively. They don't. Then that is where when I think at some point when I was answering Sukrita's question, I said that we lack the infrastructure and we don't
And even
put enough
getting
budget.
there, even
Yeah.
getting there doesn't happen.
Even getting there.
Yeah, like
All they'll do is pick them up, dump them there, right?
Mhm.
So I think there needs to be a change in approaching this situation. I think what I've seen in Delhi, perhaps, is that the judges at the JJBs are now younger people,
Mhm.
and presiding officers are younger people, and somehow there is a shift in the perspective, but it's a very nascent stage, and that sort of reform is going to take a while, but as long as it is happening.
Right.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Sneha, for joining us today. It has been wonderful talking to you after so long. I mean, and of course, I'm looking forward to meet you here next month. Yeah, and to everyone who is present now, please share your mail IDs for the certificate, and we'll meet you, Sneha, very soon
Yes,
in
sure.
another sessions or in some other capacity. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you.
Sukrit, for like hosting the session, and Bilal, thanks everybody. Thanks a lot. Okay, see you guys in the next session. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Siddharth, wait a minute.